Slow democracy takes its inspiration from the slow food movement, which began in Rome and then has really evolved into a whole idea of the localvore movement, which is very, very strong in Vermont. And localvore people say, this is crazy, the way our food system is set up. Why are we bringing in tomatoes from 3,000 miles away? You get them here and they taste like cardboard. That doesn't make any sense. We have the capacity right here in our own community to foster farms and to develop relationships between farmers and eaters, which is all of us, and have a very vital, lively food system. And so we took that idea of slow and we thought, wow, what are the insights that we can take from slow food and the localvore movement and apply to our democratic structures? Because right now, Washington is like that faraway farm that is generating these laws, and that tomato that tastes like cardboard is like a lot of these mandates that come down from Washington. And so what can we do that's really vital in our own self-governance locally? In Vermont, we have so many examples of how individuals and towns and counties have been able to do all kinds of really, really exciting work on the local level. And so I thought, local, this is where the action is. And I still think that's incredibly important. What I learned over the course of writing of the book was the importance of dialogue and deliberation, and that did not come easily for me. I am someone who likes action. I don't like meetings. I don't like sitting there. I think, when can I get home? And so I was not as convinced that it was so important for all of us to get together and have conversation and share ziti casserole or something like that. But working with Susan and seeing the examples, talking about these different examples of communities in action really convinced me. Particularly Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They were in the middle of this bitter redistricting, school redistricting fight in their community. And there was a rich elementary school that was busting out at the seams, and there were two poor ones that were losing students. And the obvious answer was to just move some students from the one to the two other ones. But they went through this whole process where they were able to create study circles so that these people from both communities could come together and to talk to each other and to realize what goals they had in common. And at the end of the day, they came out of it with this very specific plan that involved moving a small number of students from the bursting school to the smaller ones. And school politics is some of the bitterest that you can get. People get really, they butt head to head. And so for them to be able to do that and to take these possibilities that weren't there in the national conversation. In the national conversation, you're either sort of for or against. There are two places to be. And what Portsmouth was able to do through these study circles was to develop some very practical, on-the-ground solutions to problems that wouldn't have been possible if they weren't in fact sitting together and talking about these issues. What we do in this book is we suggest 3 basic principles for any slow democratic process. So this might apply to town meetings, it might apply to participatory budgeting, it might apply to study circles. But these processes need to be inclusive, they need to bring everyone to the table, they need to be deliberative, so it's not just voting or an up or down type of situation. It has to be people discussing what their most basic values are and how to get there, problem solving. And third of all, they have to be empowered, because you can have all those conversations and they can be great, but at the end of the day, if you're not allowed to impact your own government, what use is it? So those are the 3 elements that we've identified. And there are many different forms of processes that can fulfill all 3 elements. One of my favorite examples is looking at Chicago community policing. And they wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as slow democracy because they were developing these processes without that framework. But in the early 90s, Chicago had just terrible relationships between the police department and the citizens. And so they said, how can we improve this? And they began holding monthly meetings in each of the police districts and inviting both police officers, and community members. And they would sit there and they would say, okay, well, what are the challenges in this particular district? What do the police see as the challenges, and what do the residents see as the challenges? And these are people who had been really facing off before. And in one particular community in the north side of Chicago, there was a park called Gill Park, and it was really overgrown, a lot of shrubbery, and it was a big drug dealing center. And so, dealers would go in and they would hang out in the shrubbery, And then there were drive-by shootings, of course, associated with that. And the residents came in and said, we can't live with this. What are we going to do? And so together with the police, using that police know-how, they were able to identify, okay, here are the conditions that are allowing these drug dealers to be here. They have this cover, and there's no lighting and there's no walk-through police. And so they went in together, the police and the citizens, they went in, they re-landscaped the park. The police committed to doing walkthroughs of that park. And residents who lived in the nearby housing projects, these tall towers, committed to calling in when they saw suspicious activity in the park. And so as a result, all the crime in the park dropped pretty much instantaneously. And so that's a great example of something that would never have happened if you didn't involve the community and the police officers talking together. My co-author, Susan Clark, is a dialogue and deliberation expert. She knows all about running or different kinds of democratic processes. She is the town moderator for our town meeting in Middlesex. And so she was able to draw on her network of all the different exciting things that are happening in dialogue and deliberation. She's also a Switzer Fellow, and so she was able to put out all kinds of connections there and get really exciting examples of what's happening in local democracy. I'm a historian, and so what I was able to do was to show how the public process has really thinned out over the last 2 centuries. When Tocqueville came, he saw these lively towns with everybody engaged in the democratic process, and they're all weighing in. And gradually, over the course of the 20th century, and up till now, we have this process where democratic involvement involves walking into a ballot booth and casting a ballot or pressing a button, and that's not democracy. And so once we understand that what we think of as democracy is not what the founders were envisioning or what people have been used to for much of the history of this country, that forces us to really look at what we mean by democracy and how we can get it back. What slow democracy does is it offers a way of rethinking and a set of principles so that people can find their own processes that work for themselves in their own communities. In Vermont, we have town meetings, and they work incredibly well here. But in California, that's not a tradition, and there are other traditions there that people can build on. But if they can look and say, okay, well, in order to be really a valuable local democratic process, something needs to be inclusive, it needs to be deliberative, and it needs to be empowered. That provides enough of a framework for people to say, look, here's how we can do it in our area. We don't have to have town meetings and apples like they do in Vermont. We can have oranges and some other process in California. And so people can take that inspiration and use it from wherever they are, so that this democratic possibility sort of rises up locally, and hopefully, I think in some ways that can have an impact on the national conversation.